When a 600-year-old superpower finally drops dead, what actually kills it? If you think about the fall of the Ottoman Empire, your brain probably goes straight to the movies. You picture the blistering desert sand. You picture men on horseback, Lawrence of Arabia blowing up train tracks, and massive, sweeping military defeats. You've been told the story of an ancient, crumbling giant, the so-called sick man of Europe. The textbook version says this empire was just too backwards, too slow, and too technologically primitive to survive the modern age. You're taught that it was finally destroyed by the brutal mechanized meat grinder of the First World War, and then carved up by the victorious Allied powers. It's a tragic, romantic, blood-soaked story. But what if I told you that almost everything you believe about the collapse of this massive empire is a complete distraction? What if I told you the Ottoman Empire didn't actually die on the battlefields of World War I? The truth is, the empire was already a walking corpse decades before a single shot was ever fired in the Great War. It wasn't dismantled by generals. It was dismantled by bankers. We are taught about the Grand Sultans. We are taught about the military campaigns and the geopolitical chess matches that shaped the modern Middle East. But here's the part they don't teach you. Empires do not run on history, and they do not run on pride. They run on cash. They run on gold, on trade, on hard currency. And by the middle of the 19th century, the mighty Ottoman Empire was flat broke. To hide this terrifying reality from their rivals, and to desperately try to keep their massive territories glued together, the Ottoman leadership walked into a financial trap so perfectly designed and so entirely ruthless that it quietly became the exact blueprint for how modern global superpowers subjugate developing nations today. They didn't lose their sovereignty to an invading army. They voluntarily handed it over, signature by signature, to a cartel of European bondholders. It all started with a war. It usually does. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire was locked in the Crimean War against Russia. It was a brutal fight, and the Ottomans desperately needed modern weapons. They needed steamships, they needed telegraph lines, and most importantly, they needed to pay their soldiers. But the imperial treasury was completely empty. For centuries, the Ottomans had funded their empire the old-fashioned way, through conquest, taxation, and controlling the global trade routes between Europe and Asia. But the world had changed. The trade routes had shifted to the oceans. The domestic economy had stagnated. So, for the very first time in their incredibly long history, the Ottoman Sultan did something completely unprecedented. He reached out to the financial capitals of London and Paris, and he asked for a foreign loan. On paper, it looked harmless. It really did. It was framed as a friendly, civilized transaction between allies. After all, the British and the French were fighting alongside the Ottomans in the Crimea, so, of course, their bankers were happy to help fund the war effort. The European banks handed over the money, the Ottomans bought the guns, they paid the troops, and they survived the war. But that single, seemingly harmless loan was a poison pill, because when you are a sprawling, struggling empire that has just discovered the absolute magic of European credit, you don't just stop at one loan. The Ottomans had tasted the absolute drug of foreign debt. Suddenly, the Sultan and his ministers realized they didn't have to reform their massive, inefficient economy. They didn't have to face the incredibly unpopular, dangerous task of taxing their own wealthy elites. They could just borrow, and borrow they did. Over the next 20 years, the Ottoman government went on a sovereign borrowing spree that absolutely defies logic. They took out loan after loan after loan from European financial markets. But here's the sick twist. They weren't using this borrowed money to build factories. They weren't using it to modernize their agriculture or build a self-sustaining industrial economy. They were using it to build palaces. Massive, sprawling, European-style luxury palaces along the Bosphorus, like the breathtaking Dolmabahce Palace, which cost the equivalent of billions of dollars today. They were spending massive amounts of borrowed cash just to maintain the visual illusion of imperial wealth. They were hoping that if they just looked rich enough, if they threw enough lavish parties, the Europeans would keep lending them money. And for a while, the European bankers were absolutely thrilled to do it. Why wouldn't they be? But here's the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of how this 19th century debt trap actually worked. The European bankers weren't stupid. They knew the Ottoman Empire was a massive financial risk. So they didn't just give them money at normal interest rates. They demanded incredibly high yields. And worse, the bonds were sold at a massive discount. Let me explain what that means in plain English, because it is the core of the entire scam. The Ottoman government would sign a legally binding piece of paper saying they owed a European bank £100 million, and they promised to pay interest on that full £100 million. But the bank would only actually hand over, say, £70 million in cash. The rest was skimmed right off the top as fees, commissions, and risk premiums. So the Ottomans were instantly underwater the very second the ink dried on the contract. They were paying interest on money they never even received. Within a few short years, a terrifying mathematical reality set in. The Ottomans had to take out new loans just to pay the interest on the old loans. Then, a few years later, they had to take out even more loans just to pay the interest on the interest. The debt grew and it grew, and it grew. It became a towering, unpayable mountain of paper. The Sultan and his ministers were trapped in a classic financial death spiral. By the 1870s, the Ottoman Empire was spending more than half of its entire national revenue just trying to service its foreign debt. Half the wealth of the entire empire, generated by millions of hardworking farmers, merchants, and tradesmen from the Balkans to Baghdad, was being shoveled directly into the pockets of wealthy investors sitting in cafes in London and Paris. But there is a law of gravity in finance that no empire, no matter how grand, can ever escape. Eventually, you run out of other people's money. In 1875, the inevitable happened. The music stopped. The Ottoman government completely ran out of cash. The state treasury was empty. They couldn't secure any new loans to pay off the old ones. So, the Sultan issued what became known as the Ramazan Decree. He basically threw his hands up in the air, looked at the world, and declared that the Ottoman Empire was completely mathematically bankrupt. They defaulted on their debt. Total panic swept through the financial capitals of Europe. Thousands of wealthy European bondholders demanded their governments do something. They demanded their money back. And this is exactly where the story shifts from a tale of financial incompetence to one of the darkest, most aggressive, and quietest corporate takeovers in human history. Before we look at how the European bankers literally took over a sovereign nation from the inside out, if you are fascinated by the hidden mechanics of power, and you want to keep pulling back the curtain on the real financial forces that run our world, make sure you hit subscribe. Because the way this empire was gutted is exactly what is happening to developing nations right now, today. When the Ottomans defaulted, the British and the French didn't immediately send in their armies. Sending armies is expensive. Sending armies is messy, and soldiers get killed. Instead, they sent accountants. In 1881, the European creditors forced the crippled, desperate Ottoman government to sign a deeply humiliating document called the Decree of Muharrem. With that one piece of paper, the Ottoman Empire effectively surrendered its economic sovereignty. The Europeans established a brand new organization right in the heart of Istanbul. It was called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, or the OPDA. I want you to really, truly understand what this organization was. The OPDA was not a government embassy. It was an independent, foreign-controlled mega corporation operating inside the borders of the Ottoman Empire, and its sole purpose was to extract wealth from the Ottoman people and send it back to Europe. The Sultan didn't control it. The Ottoman Parliament didn't control it. It was run by a board of directors made up entirely of European bankers. And they didn't just sit in a dusty office reviewing spreadsheets. The OPDA was given direct, absolute, unquestioned control over some of the most vital tax revenues in the entire empire. They took over the taxes on salt. They took over the taxes on tobacco. They took over the taxes on silk, on fishing, and on stamp duties. If an ordinary Ottoman farmer grew tobacco in his field in Anatolia, he didn't pay a tax to his local governor. He didn't pay a tax to the Sultan. He paid a tax directly to this foreign corporation. The OPDA grew so massive, so incredibly powerful, that it actually had more employees than the entire official Ottoman Ministry of Finance. It became a state within a state. It even had its own armed guards and its own private corporate police force to hunt down smugglers who tried to bypass the European tax collectors. Just think about the sheer psychological devastation of that. Imagine you're an Ottoman citizen at the turn of the century. Your ancestors conquered continents. Your empire was once the absolute terror of the globe. And now a guy in a tailored European suit, backed by a private corporate militia, is standing in your village demanding a cut of your daily fishing catch, so that a banker in London can buy a new country estate. The empire had become a hollow shell. The Sultan was still sitting on his throne. He was still wearing his elaborate robes. He was still holding his grand, beautiful ceremonies in his debt-funded palaces. But he was essentially just a highly paid middle manager for a European collection agency. The boardroom had entirely conquered the empire, and the financial bleeding didn't stop there. It never does. Because once the Europeans controlled the Ottoman economy, they used that immense leverage to force the empire into even deeper traps. European companies came in and offered to build massive infrastructure projects, like the famous railways across the Middle East. But again, the terms were violently predatory. They demanded what was called kilometer guarantees. This meant the Ottoman government had to guarantee a certain amount of profit for every single kilometer of track the Europeans laid down. If the train ran empty, it didn't matter. The Ottoman taxpayers still had to pay the European railway companies the difference. So what did the companies do? They built train lines that twisted and turned unnecessarily, winding wildly through flat terrain, adding hundreds of completely useless miles to the track just to extract more guaranteed cash from the dying empire. It was legalized, state-sponsored robbery, hidden behind the mask of modernization. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the decisions being made on the battlefields were entirely dictated by the crushing weight of this unpayable debt. Historians believe that one of the main reasons the Ottoman Empire desperately allied with Germany in the lead-up to World War I wasn't just shared ideology or a sudden love of German culture. It was a desperate, final, agonizing gamble to break out of the financial cage. Germany promised them a way out. The moment the Ottomans officially entered the Great War, one of the very first things they did before the major battles even started, was unilaterally abolish the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. They kicked the foreign accountants out of the buildings. They tore up the ledgers. They were essentially fighting a massive apocalyptic global war just to declare bankruptcy and wipe their credit history clean. But, of course, they lost the war, and when the victorious Allied powers finally sat down at the table to carve up the Middle East, they weren't just dividing up land and oil. They were dividing up the assets of a defaulted debtor. The map of the modern Middle East, the borders of Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, was drawn by the exact same nations who had spent the last 50 years financially suffocating the empire. They didn't just win a war. They finally foreclosed on the property. Millions of ordinary people who had spent generations paying crushing taxes to foreign bankers, were violently ripped apart by the consequences of boardroom decisions they had absolutely no say in. They suffered through famine, displacement, and total societal collapse, all because their leaders 50 years earlier had fallen for the illusion that they could borrow their way to power. And the most chilling part of this entire story is not that it happened over a century ago. It's that the exact same system is operating right now, at this very second. The concept of using unpayable debt to completely strip a sovereign nation of its independence did not end with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It was simply modernized. It was put into a nicer briefcase. When you look at the world today, when you look at developing nations across Africa, Latin America, or South Asia, you see the exact same blueprint playing out in real time. Governments desperate for cash are taking out massive loans from global superpowers and international financial institutions. On paper, it looks harmless. Just like in 1854, it's framed as development assistance or infrastructure investment, but the mechanics are identical. They borrow billions to build massive ports, sprawling highways, and shiny new airports that they cannot realistically afford. The debt grows, the hidden fees stack up, the interest compounds, and when the inevitable default happens, the modern creditors don't send in armies either. They send in accountants. They demand what they now call structural adjustments. They force the developing nations to privatize their water, their electricity, their natural resources. They force them to hand over control of their actual physical ports and railways to foreign corporations on 99-year leases. The modern political leaders, just like the sultans of the past, get to stay in their palaces and pretend they are in charge of their countries. They get to hold the parades and wave the flags. But the real power belongs to the people holding the debt. The rules of the game have never changed. The guy with the gun always, eventually, works for the guy with the ledger. We look back at the collapse of empires and we want to find a romantic, simple narrative. We want to believe they fall because of epic battles, bad generals, or shifting cultures, but the real mechanics of collapse are usually deeply quiet. They are written in ink, heavily discounted, and buried in the fine print of a loan agreement. An empire doesn't die when its walls are breached. It dies the moment its credit runs out.